Here are 7 psychological tricks people use to control you that, if you don't understand them, can make it difficult to realize that the problem is not with you, but with the other person. Because control does not always look like control. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like the other person is the victim and you're the bad guy. This video is going to help you understand if you are already inside one of these psychological patterns without noticing. So stay with me. But first, subscribe and like the video so you don't miss other psychological lessons. Because people who miss insights like this often learn these patterns the hard way. Trick 1, the silent treatment. One of the most powerful psychological tricks people use does not involve shouting, arguing, or forcing anything. In fact, it often looks like the absence of communication, silence. When someone suddenly stops responding, stops acknowledging you, or emotionally withdraws without explanation, it creates a strange mental pressure. You begin to replay conversations in your mind. You wonder if you said something wrong. You analyze small details that normally would not matter. This reaction is not random. Human beings are deeply wired for social connection. Our brains interpret silence from someone important to us as a form of social rejection. And rejection triggers anxiety. That anxiety creates a powerful psychological shift. Instead of calmly observing the situation, many people begin chasing reassurance. They send another message. They try to fix something that may not even be broken. They start seeking validation from the very person who created the silence. And that is where the balance of power quietly shifts. The person who withdraws suddenly becomes the one who controls the emotional tempo of the interaction. They decide when the conversation resumes. They decide when the tension ends. Now, not everyone uses silence intentionally. Sometimes people genuinely need space or time to process emotions. But when silence becomes a pattern used to make someone else anxious or desperate for attention, it becomes a psychological tool. Because silence forces the other person to fill the empty space with their own thoughts. And often those thoughts are self-doubt. But silence is only one way influence happens. Sometimes control is not about withdrawing attention. Sometimes it is about giving attention in a way that keeps someone emotionally hooked. Trick 2, hot and cold behavior. Have you ever interacted with someone who seems incredibly engaged one moment and strangely distant the next? One day they are enthusiastic, supportive, and attentive. The next day they are cold, distracted, or completely uninterested. This unpredictable shift creates confusion. But more importantly, it creates something much stronger than simple confusion: emotional dependency. Human psychology is heavily influenced by reward patterns. When rewards are consistent and predictable, the brain eventually adapts and loses excitement. But when rewards are unpredictable, something very different happens. The brain becomes obsessed with trying to predict when the next reward will arrive. This is known in psychology as intermittent reinforcement, and it is one of the strongest behavioral conditioning mechanisms ever observed. It is the same principle that makes gambling addictive. When someone alternates between warmth and distance, attention and neglect, approval and indifference, the brain begins chasing the moments of positive attention. Instead of evaluating the relationship objectively, the mind becomes focused on recovering that feeling of connection again. Maybe if I say this, maybe if I act differently. And without realizing it, the emotional focus shifts toward regaining their approval. Some people use this behavior unconsciously because they themselves are emotionally inconsistent. But others understand exactly what it does, because unpredictability creates emotional investment. And when someone becomes emotionally invested in winning back attention, influence quietly begins to grow. But there is another psychological trick that works in a completely different way. Instead of making you chase attention, it makes you feel responsible for someone else's emotions. Trick 3, playing the victim. There is a form of influence that does not look like power at all. In fact, it often looks like weakness. When someone constantly positions themselves as the victim in every situation, something subtle happens inside the minds of the people around them. Humans are naturally wired to empathize with suffering. When we see someone struggling or hurt, our instinct is often to comfort them, support them, or protect them. This instinct is important for social cooperation, but it can also be used as a psychological shortcut to gain control. Because if someone convinces you that they are always the one being wronged, you may start adjusting your behavior to avoid hurting them. You may begin apologizing more often. You may become careful with your words around them. Over time, the emotional dynamic changes. Instead of mutual accountability, one person becomes the permanent victim, while the other becomes the one responsible for maintaining emotional peace. And that imbalance gives the victim a surprising amount of influence. Criticizing them feels cruel. Questioning them feels insensitive. So people often remain silent, even when something feels unfair. If this idea is making you think differently about social behavior, consider subscribing, because understanding patterns like this early can help you navigate relationships with much more clarity. But even more powerful than playing the victim is a trick that directly interferes with how you trust your own perception of reality. Trick 4, gaslighting. Imagine explaining something that happened, and the other person calmly tells you that it never happened. Or they tell you that you misunderstood, that you are overreacting, that your memory is wrong. At first, this may seem like a simple disagreement about facts. But when this kind of response happens repeatedly, something deeper begins to take place. Your confidence in your own perception starts to weaken. You begin questioning your memory. You hesitate before trusting your interpretation of events. And once someone starts doubting their own perception, they become much more dependent on external confirmation. That is why gaslighting can be such a powerful psychological tactic. It slowly shifts the authority over reality from your own mind to someone else's narrative. Now, not every disagreement is gaslighting. People can genuinely remember events differently. But when someone consistently reframes reality in a way that protects their actions while making you feel confused or irrational, the psychological effect can be profound. Because if you cannot trust your own interpretation of events, it becomes easier for someone else to define what is true. And when control over perception shifts, influence becomes much easier. But sometimes manipulation does not happen through confusion. Sometimes it happens through overwhelming positivity. Trick 5, love bombing. At first, it feels incredible. Someone showers you with attention, compliments come constantly, messages are frequent, they express intense admiration very quickly. You feel seen, appreciated, maybe even special. This phase often creates a rapid emotional connection because human beings respond strongly to validation. When someone makes us feel valued and important, the brain releases chemicals associated with reward and bonding. But sometimes that intense affection appears faster than genuine emotional intimacy normally develops. And when emotional intensity accelerates too quickly, it can create a powerful psychological bond before someone has had time to truly evaluate the relationship. Later, if that same person begins withdrawing the attention they once gave freely, the emotional contrast becomes very noticeable. The brain remembers the earlier affection and tries to recover it. What changed? Did I do something wrong? This dynamic can create a cycle where someone becomes focused on regaining the early version of the relationship that felt so powerful. But sometimes control is not created through affection or confusion. Sometimes it is created through something much simpler: fear of losing an opportunity. Trick 6, artificial scarcity. Human decision-making changes dramatically when we believe something may disappear. When time feels limited or opportunities feel rare, our brains shift into urgency mode. We become less analytical and more reactive. This is why phrases like last chance or limited opportunity are so persuasive in marketing. But the same principle appears in personal interactions as well. When someone subtly suggests that their time, attention, or presence is rare or easily replaceable, it can create pressure. You may feel like you need to prove your value quickly. You may feel hesitant to question their behavior because you worry about losing the connection entirely. Scarcity increases perceived value, even when the scarcity itself may be exaggerated or strategically presented. And when someone believes they might lose access to something meaningful, they are often willing to tolerate behavior they would normally question. But there is one more psychological trick that works not through fear or affection, but through social pressure. Trick 7, social proof manipulation. Human beings rarely make decisions in complete isolation. We constantly look around to see what others believe, what others approve of, and what others accept. This tendency is known as social proof. When many people appear to support an idea or person, our brains instinctively assume there must be some validity behind it, because historically, aligning with the group often increased chances of survival. But this instinct can also be exploited. If someone creates the impression that everyone agrees with them, it becomes psychologically uncomfortable to disagree. Challenging the majority can trigger fear of exclusion or criticism, so people often remain silent even when they have doubts. Over time, the appearance of agreement reinforces itself, because the more people stay quiet, the stronger the illusion of consensus becomes. And once a narrative appears socially accepted, questioning it becomes harder. So here's the final thought. Psychological influence does not always look obvious. Most of the time, it appears inside ordinary conversations, emotional reactions, and subtle shifts in attention. Understanding these patterns does not mean becoming suspicious of everyone, but it does mean becoming more aware of how human behavior works. Because awareness changes how you respond. Instead of reacting automatically, you begin observing patterns. And the moment you start observing patterns, that influence of those patterns loses much of its power on you. If you want to keep learning how human psychology shapes everyday interactions, consider subscribing to this channel. Mindframe is our name here, and people like you are very welcome on board. Because people who understand these dynamics early often navigate relationships with much more confidence. And when something that looks like psychological control comes in from someone else, you see it from far and become guarded against its influences. So right now, at the end of the video, I'm curious, which of these psychological tricks have you noticed most often in real life? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video. Don't forget subscribing and liking this video.